The morning calendar in municipal court moved quietly along. People shifted on worn benches, papers folded in their hands. A teacher in a cardigan and a bus driver waited in the same row. An older man in a veteran's cap leaned on his cane. At the bench, the judge worked through minor cases: a noise complaint, a red light camera, a blocked driveway. He asked a few questions: trimmed a fine here, dismissed a charge there. There were sighs of relief. "Thank you, Judge." And then each person stepped aside for the next. A nurse in scrubs came forward when her name was called, explained she had left a patient to appear, and left again with less to pay. The clerk reached for the next file. Then the back door opened again. The sound of her heels on the tile was the first difference: sharp taps that cut through coughs and rustling paper. She walked in as if she were entering a lobby, not a courtroom. Mid-20s, tailored coat, phone in her hand, screen lit. Her eyes moved over the room without pausing, past the clerk, the officers, the crowded benches. Where others stepped carefully, she took the center aisle as if it were hers. She reached the rail, set her phone on the defendant's table, and slid a small stack of documents toward the clerk with the back of her hand. The bus driver straightened. The veteran watched her, jaw tight. The judge picked up the citation and adjusted his glasses. "You're charged with parking in front of a fire hydrant on Atwells Avenue," he said. "How do you plead?" She met his gaze. Her expression was calm, almost bored. "It's just a ticket," she said. "In our family, we don't pay fines. This is a formality." The room stopped moving. The judge's hand paused on the file. He lifted his head slowly, studying the young woman in front of him. The easy warmth he had shown a moment earlier cooled. "A formality?" he repeated. "Young lady, do you understand where you are right now?" Her shoulders rose and fell in a small shrug. "I'm in court," she replied. "But let's not pretend we all live by the same rules. We have our way of handling things. You know that." For the first time that morning, the judge did not move straight to the next question. He leaned back, folded his hands, and looked out over the benches before turning back to her. "Miss," he said, his voice lower now, "outside these walls, I can't speak to what you're used to. In this room, the rules are the same for everyone." She held his look without blinking, the faintest suggestion of a smile at one corner of her mouth, as if she had heard such words before and learned not to believe them. Around her, people who had counted out dollars for gas and fines stared with a new, unsettled attention. The judge had listened to excuses for years, yet as he watched her standing there, so sure of invisible rules no one else could see, another question rose in his mind, and in the room itself. Who was she, that she could speak of "our family," as though the law were something meant mainly for other people? The judge read her full name again, this time more slowly. A small crease appeared between his brows. He set the file down, tapped the cover once with his index finger, and looked at her as though seeing her for the first time. A murmur rippled across the benches. Two women exchanged a quick glance. The veteran adjusted his cap. The judge spoke the name aloud. It hung in the room like a dropped tool, sharp, unmistakable. People in Providence had heard it on evening news segments, and in stories, neighbors whispered over chain-link fences. A state representative with too much influence and too many unanswered questions orbiting him. Campaign donations from opaque groups, public funds that vanished into consulting, contracts that jumped to companies no one had ever heard of. Nothing proven, nothing resolved. But the reputation lingered. The young woman shifted her weight, her gaze steady but not combative. It wasn't arrogance, it was a habit. A world she had absorbed since childhood, one where hallways cleared before she entered, where inconveniences evaporated before they reached her. The judge saw it. Not hostility, a void, an absence of understanding about how ordinary life worked. He asked, "Have you had prior issues with parking enforcement?" She answered breezily, "Not that I know of. If there were, they handled it." "Who is they?" he asked. She blinked as though genuinely unsure why that mattered. "I don't know. Staff. Someone." Behind her, the veteran exhaled through his nose. The teacher folded her arms. On the other side of the aisle, a man in a windbreaker waited for his turn. His citation sat on his lap. He had parked in a restricted zone on the day he drove himself to a chemotherapy session. He had apologized twice already, to the clerk, then the officer, for being late, and for not walking fast enough. His eyes drifted to the young woman's designer coat, the jewelry that glinted in the fluorescent light. She noticed him watching and turned her head away, gaze returning to her phone screen. The judge picked up her file again. A second page slid loose. He scanned it, and the faint crease deepened. "According to the system," he said, "you've had 7 prior warnings within the last year and a half." She looked mildly puzzled. "Really? I never saw them." "They were issued," he continued, "and then they disappeared." A low sound moved through the benches, half disbelief, half recognition. "Disappeared?" she echoed. The judge examined her, searching for the intent behind her expression. But she wasn't pretending. She truly didn't grasp the weight of what he was saying. To her, problems were things that vanished on their own. There had always been adults, drivers, aides, security staff, whose job it was to smooth the road in front of her. He asked, "Do you understand that warnings don't simply erase themselves?" She paused, longer this time. A subtle tremor touched her fingers as she tucked her hair behind one ear. "I was told," she said carefully, "that the system sorts minor things automatically." Someone in the back muttered, "Sure it does." Her posture stayed upright, but something in her confidence faltered. She wasn't being defiant now, she was exposed, unprepared for a world in which explanations required more than inherited assurance. The judge's tone softened, not with sympathy, but with clarity. "Miss," he said, "this courtroom is full of people who have never had anything disappear for them. They've waited, they've paid, they've lived with consequences. You may not have meant disrespect, but you're standing in a very different reality than the rest of this room." She lowered her gaze for the first time. The veteran leaned forward slightly. The man with the chemotherapy appointment clasped his hands tighter. The teacher stopped tapping her foot. The judge turned the page again. Something new caught his eye. His voice, when he spoke next, carried a weight that gathered the room in close. "These warnings," he said, "weren't erased by accident." Her head lifted. He held her stare. Someone intervened. More than once. A quiet tension pressed in around them. It was no longer about a ticket. Not for her, not for the judge, not for anyone listening. The judge closed the file slowly, as if giving the room a moment to settle. When he spoke again, his voice was even, but edged with purpose. "Did you drive the same vehicle here today?" The question dropped with no warning, no explanation, no hint of what he was building toward. She blinked, taken off guard. "Why does that matter?" "It matters," he replied, "because the details do." A flicker ran across her expression, quick, taut, instinctive. Not guilt, not defiance. Something more primal. Unease. The judge nodded to the clerk. A printed sheet slid onto his bench. He lifted it toward the light. "This is the enforcement photo from the day of the citation," he said. "You stated you stopped for only a minute." Her jaw tightened, but she said nothing. He angled the sheet so it caught the overhead glare. This image was taken 12 minutes after the first timestamp. The vehicle had not moved. There were no hazard lights, and He tapped the corner of the page. Someone was sitting in the driver's seat. A whisper rose through the rows of benches. People leaned in. The young woman finally spoke, quiet but clipped. "I don't see how that's relevant." "You will," he said. Before she could answer, a voice came from behind her, unexpected, steady. "Your Honor, if I may?" All eyes shifted. An elderly woman in a knitted hat stood halfway down the aisle. She looked like someone who spent her mornings at the market and her afternoons tending flowers. She held her handbag firmly, as if bracing herself. The judge considered, then gestured for her to step forward. She approached the front with small, resolute steps. "I was across the street that morning," she said. "I saw her. 2 firefighters asked her driver to move the car because they needed access to the hydrant." The young woman stiffened. The older woman continued, her voice unwavering. "She told them she didn't have to, that they should find another hydrant. They said they couldn't." She raised her voice. A surge of reaction swept the room. Shocked breaths, a few incredulous exclamations held to a whisper. The judge turned back to the defendant. "Is that accurate?" She swallowed. "People exaggerate." He didn't press. Instead, he slid the file aside and picked up a second sheet, one he had not shown before. "This car," he said, "is not registered to you." Silence fell again. "It isn't registered to your father either." She exhaled sharply, more confused than cornered. "It belongs," the judge said, "to a private corporation currently under state review for contract irregularities." A man in the back straightened at the word corporation. Someone muttered, "Here we go." The judge laid the document on the bench. "Miss, do you have legal authorization to operate this vehicle at all?" Her mouth opened, but no answer followed. Whatever she had prepared for this morning, it was not this. Then, unexpectedly, another voice broke from the rear of the courtroom. "Your Honor, I work for that company." The speaker was a young man in a frayed jacket, no tie, hair a little uncombed. He stepped forward hesitantly, as if unsure whether he was doing something brave or foolish. The judge looked at him. "State your name, please." He did. And then, with careful diction, he added, "The vehicle she drove is officially designated as inactive. It shouldn't be on the road. Someone's been authorizing its use off the record." The young woman spun toward him, eyes wide, whispering a warning under her breath, too low for most to hear, but the judge noticed the strain in her voice. The young man continued softly, almost apologetically, "I can show documentation, if the court needs it." A palpable shiver of tension ran through the crowd. No one moved. Even the fluorescent lights seemed to hum lower. The judge folded his hands, studying the 2 young people facing him, one rigid with shock, the other trembling slightly with the weight of truth he had just released. "We started," he said, "with a parking violation." His gaze sharpened. "We are no longer discussing a parking violation?" The young woman's composure, her practiced certainty, her inherited shield, began to crack. For the first time, her eyes revealed something raw and unmistakable: fear. The judge let the silence stretch, letting everyone feel what he felt. This was no minor morning case anymore. This was the beginning of consequences long delayed, and now impossible to ignore. The judge motioned to the clerk, "Bring me the internal log for enforcement actions over the past 2 years." The request wiped the remaining ease from the room. Officers shifted. The clerk disappeared through the side door and returned with a thin stack of system printouts, pages of raw entries, timestamps, initials, internal codes. The judge scanned them, line by line. 7 warnings, 7 manual closures, all executed under the same concealed identifier, an internal code used when a high-level override masks the name of the individual who made the change. He set the papers down with deliberate care. "Miss," he said, "these warnings were not cleared by accident. They were removed by someone with elevated access." Her spine stiffened, but the confidence she once carried had drained into something tight and brittle. She looked at the papers as though they were written in a language she didn't speak. Before she could respond, the judge lifted the photo of the car again. "This vehicle," he continued, "is tied to a logistics contractor that has been the subject of multiple investigative reports." A few heads in the courtroom nodded. Locals recognized the name. Stories had surfaced about consulting fees, unusual billing, and projects that existed only in proposals. The young woman swallowed, her voice barely steady. "I was given the keys. That's all I know." "That's precisely what concerns me," the judge said. "You were given access to a car that appears to fall outside proper authorization, and warnings tied to you vanish under a code reserved for administrative intervention." The older woman who had spoken earlier raised her hand slightly, seeking permission. The judge hesitated, then allowed her to speak again. She stepped forward once more, her voice softer now, but unwavering. "There's something else. Those firefighters, when they asked her driver to move, she told them her father would take care of it, that he could fix their problem." A low ripple passed through the benches. The young woman's breath hitched. She didn't deny it this time. From the back, the young employee of the logistics company cleared his throat. "Your Honor, the vehicle logs show irregular usage. It's meant for storage transport, but it keeps being checked out after hours. There's only a handful of people who could authorize that." The judge turned slightly. "And do you know who those people are?" He hesitated, looking down, weighing his words. "I know the initials that appear most often. They match the political office connected to her family." A collective stir rose through the courtroom. Shock, recognition, and a quiet sense that something long hidden was beginning to surface. The young woman shook her head, pleading more with herself than anyone else. "I didn't ask for any of that. I barely know how any of this works." The judge didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. That is exactly why we must understand it. He looked again at the logs, then at the two unexpected witnesses, then at her. "This is no longer simply a question of responsibility," he said. "It is a question of influence, of access, and of whether the systems meant to serve the public have been used to shield a single individual." Her breath quickened. He leaned forward, folding his hands. "I have enough here to request further review from the Attorney General's office." A hush fell so complete, the buzz of the lights became audible. She stared at him, the last remnants of her practiced composure dissolving. For the first time, panic rose clearly in her eyes. Not fury, not entitlement. Fear of a truth she had never thought could reach her. The judge didn't look angry. He looked resolute. "We began with a parked car," he said quietly, "but we have arrived at something far larger." She exhaled, shaky and small, nothing like the woman who had walked in as though the room belonged to her. "And I assure you," the judge added, "this court does not look away simply because someone expects it to." The last words settled over her like a weight she'd never carried before. She lowered her gaze, gripping the table edge, as if the room had tilted beneath her feet. This was no longer about her father, no longer about a ticket, not even about the hydrant. This was the moment her world, so carefully padded, so neatly arranged, finally cracked. The judge let the papers rest on the bench as though their weight alone explained everything that had brought them to this point. Then he looked directly at the young woman, not with suspicion now, but with an unsettling clarity, the kind that saw past posture and privilege to the human being hiding underneath. "Miss," he said, Help me understand something. She braced herself, fingers gripping the table edge. Why did you believe the rules didn't apply to you? It wasn't an accusation. It was a plain question, spoken with a steadiness that made it impossible to deflect. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. The silence stretched until it became almost painful. Finally, she managed, I never questioned it. Things were always handled. A faint tremor ran through her voice. No one ever explained why. I just followed what I saw. A murmur rolled softly through the benches, some pity, some frustration, some disbelief. The veteran shifted his cane aside and leaned back, eyes narrowing. The man who had parked during his cancer treatment lowered his gaze, wrestling with sympathy and indignation at once. The judge leaned back slightly. You know, he said, people often assume that advantage is a blessing, but advantage without guidance? He let the thought linger. Her chin dipped. She looked suddenly young, stripped of the armor she'd worn when she arrived. Let me tell you something, the judge continued, his tone turning firm but strangely gentle. The law isn't the enemy. It's the boundary that keeps life from becoming chaos. It's what protects the weak from the strong. And sometimes, he paused, his expression softening, it protects the children of powerful people from the very power surrounding them. She raised her eyes, startled, not by the words themselves, but by the fact that they didn't come coated in anger. He continued, if no one ever taught you responsibility, then someone failed you long before you walked into this courtroom. Even the clerk looked up at that. And as for your father, the judge said, lowering his voice, shielding you from consequences is not the same as caring for you. One is protection, the other is neglect, dressed as power. Something in her changed at those words, a tiny collapse behind her eyes, as though she were hearing, for the first time in her life, a truth no one in her world had dared to say aloud. The judge folded his hands. Now, let's talk about your case. He picked up the citation. You did park illegally. You obstructed emergency access. You disregarded lawful direction. A beat. I am imposing the standard fine. Some in the room nodded approvingly. Others expected more. But the judge wasn't finished. He set the citation aside and looked directly at her. You're also going to complete community service. He paused. At the fire station on Atwells Avenue. Gasps scattered through the room. Her breath caught. She didn't look offended, just stunned. I've never done anything like that. That, the judge said, is exactly why you're going. A ripple of approval moved through the benches. Quiet applause from a few, murmured approval from others. Even the veteran cracked a faint smile. But the judge's tone remained steady, almost solemn. This is not punishment. It's a chance. A chance to learn what the world looks like when no one clears the path for you. She nodded slowly, not in submission, but in recognition. I'll try, she whispered. I don't know what I'm doing, but I'll try. The judge dipped his head. Trying is more than enough for today. No flourish, no theatrics, just that quiet verdict settling over her like the first brick in a foundation she'd never built for herself. Around her, the room breathed again. Shoulders loosened, arms uncrossed, the kind of collective exhale that meant something had shifted, not just legally, but morally. The teacher looked at her differently now, not approving, but no longer hostile. The man with the cancer appointment watched her with a kind of measured understanding. Even the older woman who had spoken earlier regarded her with tempered caution rather than judgment. The young woman didn't see any of it. She was staring at her hands, steady for the first time all day, realizing she was about to step into a place where no one's influence could soften the work. And maybe, Just maybe that was the point. As the judge prepared to close the file, the courtroom seemed ready to settle back into its morning rhythm. People shifted, gathering their coats and papers. The young woman exhaled, almost imperceptibly, believing the worst had passed. But the clerk stepped toward the bench and murmured something into the judge's ear. His expression changed, not with anger, but with a sharpened alertness. He straightened. "Miss," he said, "before we conclude, were you aware that your father contacted this court earlier today?" Her eyes widened. "What? No, that's not possible." A murmur rolled through the benches like a changing weather front. The judge continued. "He attempted to inquire about your case, and when he was informed he could not intervene, he pressed further." She looked genuinely shaken now. No calculation, no pretense. "I didn't know," she said softly. "He never told me?" The judge studied her face, searching for deception, and found none. "It appears," he said, "that he is more concerned about avoiding embarrassment than about helping you learn something meaningful." She looked down at the table, and for the first time there was no mask at all, only confusion and a faint trace of hurt she was too proud to show fully. The judge closed the file gently. "I've done what I can here. What happens next is up to you." A long pause, measured, deliberate. "You have an opportunity now," he said. "Not everyone gets that. And someday, you may be the one who chooses to say, 'In my family, we face our mistakes.' That would be a legacy worth keeping." She nodded, her voice caught somewhere in her throat. "I'll remember that," she managed. The judge gave a single, solemn nod. "Good luck to you." He banged the gavel lightly, not a sentence, but a signal. The crowd stirred again, but the story did not end there. As she stepped toward the aisle, people made space for her, not out of deference but out of curiosity, uncertainty, and a shifting sense of who she might be after today. Some faces watched her with hope, others with doubt, a few with something closer to forgiveness. At the door, she paused to steady her breath. That was when the young man from the logistics company appeared beside her, nervous, hands shoved into his pockets. Miss?" he said quietly. She turned, guarded but no longer cold. "There's something you should know," he whispered. "The car, it's not the only thing. There are files, emails, decisions made off the books." He glanced toward the courtroom doors, as if expecting someone to follow him. "If you want the truth about what's really going on, what your father is mixed in, find me." Her lips parted, but no answer came. He didn't wait. "You deserve to know," he added, then stepped back into the hallway traffic and disappeared into the moving crowd. She stood still for several seconds, the noise of the corridor fading around her. For the first time that day, she looked uncertain, not because she was cornered, but because the ground ahead of her was suddenly open, unmapped, unsupervised, and entirely her own. A life she might choose rather than inherit. Across the room, an older woman whispered to her neighbor, "Maybe she'll turn out all right." A man replied softly, "Depends on what she does next." The young woman closed her eyes briefly, drawing a steady breath, and stepped forward. This time without the practiced glide of privilege, but with the hesitant footing of someone taking her first honest step. Somewhere behind her, the judge announced the next case, but her story, the real one, was just beginning.